prop her up.
Ben Wright, thank you very much. Rishi Sunak, it's a bit rich, isn't it? It rings a bit hollow from someone like Theresa May, as we just heard there, because she wasn't exactly collaborative in her previous role in the Home Office. She wasn't very keen on working with the Liberal Democrats, and you were in government with them together.
Well, look, I've only been in Parliament 2 years, and I've always found her incredibly constructive and engaging when I've had issues to discuss with her. But I think the broader point that Damien Green made is right. I think people do want to see politicians working together. We're clearly not going to agree on everything, but where there can be some consensus, it seems sensible to do that in the national interest. Mental health is one area that's obvious. Dealing with counter-terrorism, workers' rights, we're going to have a big review announced tomorrow. And this isn't about, pinching Labour's ideas. These are all new challenges facing our country. And so where we can find common ground, it does seem eminently sensible to try and work together in the national interest to do that.
And parties have worked together on things like social care. The fact that much has been achieved doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. Surely it is, in the public's mind, on policies like social care, party politics should be put to one side in the national interest.
Oh, look, I don't think anyone would disagree with it, and it's nothing new, the idea of politicians from different parties working together. We do that on select committees. I've just launched a new all-party parliamentary group with the former Conservative Minister, Anna Soubry,
we'll
today,
talk more about
which
that
we can talk more about. But, I mean, I suppose the question to Rishi is if it was so imperative and so important that we deal with these issues, which, by the way, existed when she went through the door to 10 Downing Street for the first time today last year, why wasn't she calling for the cross-party consensus and for different parties to work together when she gave that speech in front of Number 10? And the reason that she wasn't asking for it then was because she didn't feel the need to. So I think this idea that she really does believe this, that it's a big imperative of our government, people will take that with a lorry load of salt because the circumstances are emanating from an election where she thought she was going to get a big majority and she's come out and she doesn't have one.
Let's leave it there. Well, Theresa May wants cross-party support on a range of policy issues, as we've just been discussing. But, of course, as was mentioned, the biggest task facing her government is negotiating the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. At last week's G20 summit, Theresa May received a big boost from US President Donald Trump, who said a very powerful free trade deal between America and the UK could be signed very quickly post-Brexit. But today, the issue of reciprocal rights for EU and UK citizens after Brexit has once again come to the fore. The European Parliament's chief negotiator, Guy Verhofstadt, and other leading MEPs have said the UK's offer on citizens' rights risks creating second-class citizenship for EU residents here. They imply that even Vote Leave during the referendum campaign were offering a more generous settlement. But the government says the letter contains a number of inaccuracies. The letter from Mr Verhofstadt and colleagues threatens that MEPs will veto any UK-EU deal if the offer for EU citizens in the UK is not improved. Closer to home, a number of MPs from across the Commons have formed a new all-party parliamentary group on EU relations to scrutinise the government over the next 2 years. Its members, as we were hearing, like Anna Soubry from Theresa May's own party and Labour's Chukka Umanna here with us today, say they should be active players in the Brexit process. Yesterday, Lib Dem leadership hopeful Vince Cable said he was beginning to think Brexit may never happen. A thought which prompted the Conservative MP Owen Paterson to describe Vince Cable as behind history on Brexit. Chukka Umanna, this new group, it will be seen as another front in trying to stop Brexit by any means necessary. And that is what it is.
By hard Brexiteers, as it were. But the bottom line is that the three things that unite the people in the group, and it isn't just me and Anna, you've also got the Deputy Leader of the Lib Dems, Jo Swinson, you've got the SNP Stephen Gething, Plaid's Jonathan Edwards, and also Caroline Lucas from the Greens. And the three things that unite all of us and the greater membership of this group is, one, we want to see the UK leave with a deal. Leaving without a deal would be absolutely appalling. Secondly, we think in the negotiation you should have all options on the table. We should go in confident with an open mind. We are the United Kingdom, the fifth biggest economy in the world. We should be ambitious in what we can get. And third, we want to see the closest possible relationship with the EU, albeit once we've left. If you look at Anna and myself, we both voted to trigger Article 50. So all this nonsense that, want to relitigate the referendum, no, we don't, or that we want to ignore the result, no, we don't. Well, but what we do want is to ensure that we have a decent deal for our constituents.
All right,
that's why we've come together in the national interest to work together to make that happen.
Before I come to Rishi, let's just exactly pinpoint what you mean. Do you want to stay in the single market?
Personally, I do.
And does this group?
Well, the members of the group want to see options on the table. Now, some people want to stay in the customs union but not the single market. Some people want to stay in the single market, not the customs union. Some people want both.
But you will be advocating within that group to remain in the single market.
That's my personal position, and it's a pledge I made to my
constituents. Well, wouldn't it just be more honest for you, in your personal capacity in this group, to say, actually, I'm campaigning to remain in the EU because staying in the single market is effectively remaining in the EU?
No, it isn't, because you have a number of countries that are not members of the European Union but are part of the single market in some way, shape or form. Like Norway's often talked about.
As part of an economic European area. Many people will say we haven't properly left the EU. You will still be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in that role, like Norway, and you will therefore be part of the EU. In what way would the UK be taking back control?
Well, three things that are often raised as problems with staying in the single market. One, I'm surprised you didn't mention actually, is free movement. That is definitely an issue. But at the moment, freedom of movement is not unconditional. I believe we could have a system of fair movement where you have free movement labour. And secondly, one thing on the sovereignty point, and you're right to talk about take back control and ask me about that. I think there's a general consensus, I'll be interested to see what Rishi says to this, that whoever you are, you want to access that single market and sell goods and services into it.
And there's no reason why we couldn't do that.
I don't disagree with that, but if we want to do that, we will have to comply with their rules, standards and regulations in any event if we have a free trade agreement.
Which is why I'm saying your view is that we don't leave the EU.
If we're in the single market.
But that was proven a dead duck by David Cameron's negotiation, and it isn't possible, it seems.
Well, hang on. David Cameron wasn't. You're not comparing like with like, because David Cameron was trying to keep us in the European Union. It was a completely different context.
In the single market, and try to limit one of the four freedoms, which was freedom of movement. We can come back to that in a moment. But Rishi, first of all, what's wrong with having an all-party group? Theresa May, as we've just discussed, wants to have consensus. She wants to have parties coming together, and this is exactly what this group that's being headed up by your colleague Anna Soubry and Chukka Umanna will do, and it'll keep all the options on the table for Brexit.
Oh, there's absolutely nothing wrong with having all-party groups. They do very good work and add to the debate. I think, though, we should be honest about what's going on. I mean, Chukka is very honest. He would like to stay in the single market. He amended the Queen's speech to that effect, and 100
I wish I had.
Yeah, well, try to.
He didn't get through. He got 101.
I think that exposes the contradiction, in the Labour Party policy. We have a clear position. We voted to leave the European Union. Staying inside the single market would be a betrayal of that vote. It means that we would still be subject to the free movement of people. We would still be subject to the European Court of Justice and paying a large amount of money into the European budget. I think people would view that as very much staying inside the European Union. So I think we need to be clear about that. Fair enough that Chukka wants to stay there. He's made that commitment to his constituents. But the rest of the country, I think we voted to leave, and leaving means removing ourselves from those institutions. And I think on that point, of course we want to have close relationships with the European Union after we leave. I completely agree. There's no reason we can't. You don't have to be a member of the single market to have access with it and to trade.
All right. Can I just because we've got very briefly, because we've got to move on to other things.
Davis says that your government's position is that you want to get the exact same benefits as you get as a member of the single market.
Well, he said that a while ago.
But the EU negotiator, chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has said you cannot have those things. You can't get the exact same benefits if you leave the single market and the customs union.
I think what we want is to replicate as closely as possible the trading arrangements within the single market, which is free and frictionless trade. The EU has signed a free trade deal with Canada, which has removed 98% of tariffs. They've just announced that they'd like to do one with Japan. I see no reason why we...
But actually,
hang on. But I see no reason why we, as you said, fifth largest economy in the world, EU's largest trading partner, why wouldn't we be able to sign a sensible free trade agreement which lets them continue to sell goods to us free of tariffs and vice versa?
Well,
Who doesn't want that to happen?
Let's have a look at the European Court of Justice, because Theresa May has been very clear that part of leaving the EU must be an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in any arbitration issue. Now, a number of senior Tories, your colleagues, if you're talking about clarity within the party, Dominic Grieve, Ed Vaizey, Nicky Morgan, have come out saying we shouldn't be as rigid as that. We shouldn't be as absolutist. Are they right?
No, I think this has been set out pretty clearly as something that we need to have our sovereignty, and having a court that is in all respects sovereign to our own courts after we leave the European Union is clearly not a sensible position to be in. And with respect to this issue of EU nationals, and this is where it's come up today with the letter from the European Parliament President, the idea that after we leave the European Union, a foreign court would be supervising the rights of
So what are you going to do over institutions like Euratom
bizarre.
or Erasmus, some of the nuclear joint bodies or education bodies that do come under the jurisdiction of the ECJ? You'll be cutting off your nose to spite your face.
No, but Joe, that's where if we are voluntarily going to enter into agreements and associations with the European Union which have a set of rules attached to them, of course, but that is something that we will voluntarily choose to do where it makes sense for both the European Union and us. But having an overarching institution sovereign over our courts is clearly not a sustainable outcome.
Right, let's talk about trade, Chukka Umanna, because we had the conversation and the comments from Donald Trump saying that pretty soon after Brexit, the US and the UK will be able to sign up to an extremely large free trade deal. We've got nothing to worry about.
Well, let's see. If you look at the comments of the president of the CBI on what Donald Trump has just said, I mean, to paraphrase him, the president of the CBI, he said, you do not agree free trade agreements through kind of bear hug diplomacy. They're very hard-nosed.
But there's got to be a will, and Donald Trump has signalled it and signalled it extremely publicly, and it's a good thing, isn't it?
Of course it's a good thing, and it's welcome, because if we leave the European Union, God knows we're going to need to be able to do as many agreements as possible once we've gone. Let's not forget what we're walking away from if we leave the customs union. The European Union has a huge number of agreements with third-party countries, the newest one being Japan, the third biggest economy in the world, and we're basically walking away from that.
And also, I mean, if we take up those comments from the president of the CBI, and even David Lidington, the minister, admitted it wouldn't replace the trade that we have currently with the EU.
I think if you look, the EU's own forecasts show that a decade from now, 90% of global demand is going to come from outside of the EU. We should be orienting our economy towards all those other countries. It's not just the US. And of course it's both. It's not just the US, it's Canada, it's Australia. The Australian Prime Minister is here today. They've all been really positive about signing new free trade agreements with us after we leave the EU.
All right.
And I said, we can, you're absolutely right, it's not either or. We can replicate the trading arrangements we have with the EU quite simply through a free trade agreement.
But they've said that's not possible.
Just
the
very
chief
briefly,
negotiator, Michel Barnier, said you cannot replicate.
Well, although
these
you
things.
want to renegotiate arrangements within the single market that people have said aren't possible. So it seems that anything is open.
But hang on, no.
I'm not going to reopen that. I shouldn't have reopened that discussion. Never mind, we're going to leave it there.
He hasn't said we can't do a trade agreement. He said
no, he hasn't said that.
Right.
He hasn't said that. I'll give you that.
In the run-up to the general election, one of Labour's flagship manifesto promises was to abolish university tuition fees and reintroduce student maintenance grants. And days before the poll, Jeremy Corbyn indicated that he would want to go even further and deal with all student debt. Yesterday, Shadow Education Secretary Angela Rayner told the Andrew Marr Show that would cost up to £100 billion and that it was an ambition for the party to announce when they could afford it. This is what she had to say.
There's three things I call on the government to do that they can do immediately. They can reverse the maintenance grants, abolishing that. That will help the most disadvantaged students. They could stop and reduce the percentage rate that students have to pay on their loans, and they can ensure that the amount that they repay, the income threshold, goes up in line with average earnings. There are three things that the Conservatives can do before September that will help students out.
Aren't you just simply spraying around huge spending promises too recklessly? I mean, another £100 billion on tuition fees right at the last minute. That's some sofa you have to find.
Well, like you said, Jeremy said that that's an ambition. It's something that he'd like to do. It's something that we will not announce that we're doing unless we can afford to do that.
Angela Rayner. Well, we're joined now by Ash Sarkar, a senior editor at Novara Media, who also lectures in politics. Welcome to The Daily Politics. Abolishing student debt was not in the Labour manifesto. It was suggested by Jeremy Corbyn, the leader, during the campaign. Did he misspeak?
I don't think he did misspeak. I think what he's doing is addressing the fact that this country is becoming increasingly debt burdened. So if you paid 9k fees, it's likely that you're looking at being burdened with 50 grand's worth of debt. Those from poorer backgrounds, that can go up to 57 grand's worth of debt. And when you add on to that the increases in household debt, right, so credit cards, stuff like that, we're now reaching financial crisis levels, right?
But you're not paying that money up front, of course, are you? This is more like a loan that is repaid once you start earning a certain amount of income. Some of it, of course, will never be paid back. So in that sense, you're not incurring debt in the same way as you've just described with credit cards.
But in an ideal world, we would, of course, be met with these fantastic jobs in which we can earn the median wage straight away. That's not happening when graduates get out of university. I've been out of university
But then you don't
for a couple of
repay,
years.
do you, if you don't earn the salary that then dictates you start to repay that loan?
That seems to me to be an absolutely wild way to run an economy, right? I'm a politics lecturer, I'm not an economics, but it seems to me that if you've got a funding model for higher education in which over a third of people are never going to repay that money, that seems to me to be utterly bananas.
So you think he is suggesting, realistically, to abolish all student debt, even if that means it could amount to something like £100 billion?
I think when you look at this country's tax collection priorities, things are totally askew. So in 2016, Revenue and Customs announced that there was £36 billion in uncollected tax, and that's before you get to things like profit sharing. Now, in other European countries, there are different models for dealing with this. Germany, for instance, doesn't charge tuition fees. And in these European countries, they also pay their lecturers more, their fractional staff more. They also pay cleaners and catering staff more.
All right, well,
improvement in conditions for everyone.
What's your view about abolishing student debt? Is that realistic?
I think certainly having it as an aspiration has to be a goal for a Labour Party that wants to ensure that regardless of your creed, colour, race or background, as Ash has outlined very eloquently, that you can get on and that it's not a barrier to higher education.
But it hasn't proven to be a barrier, has it, so far? I mean, if you look at the figures, I've got here, poorer students are still less likely to go to university overall. But since tuition fees introduced by a Labour government were brought in, it hasn't actually deterred poorer students. It's now staving, you're right, it's static, but it has gone up since 2013.
But what I was more likely to go to university today.
Well, hang just a minute, because I was about to make the point when you cut me, but I was about to make the point that what we expected would happen, which was that you would see a reduction in the numbers of people who had been on free school meals or from lower income households. That did not happen. That's because in constituencies like mine, where 1 in 3, is living in poverty, people are not going to let that be a brake on their ambition. But this issue about debt, you're absolutely right, Ash. People are saddled with this for up to 3 decades before it is written off. And that acts as a massive barrier to all the different things you want to do after you've graduated.
But the language that you're using in terms of people being saddled with debt, I mean, is that a fair representation of the current policy?
Yes, it is.
Which is, as I say, a loan that is taken out, you do not pay upfront fees, you only pay it when you start to earn a certain amount of money.
I think Ash gave the figure for lower income students, debts of £57,000 on average. That, to me, is saddling young people with a huge level of
debt. And
it
is, isn't it? I mean, it's eye-watering. I mean, if you think about what young people are having to deal with once they leave university, and as Ash said, if the well-paid jobs were there for the vast majority of them to start repaying it back in a reasonable fashion, because I take your point that you will probably make about interest rates for them, the loans are not as expensive as they would be on the market, it's still off-putting.
Well, the point is, I think you mentioned the facts, and the facts are that people from less disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to go to university today than they were. That gap has closed. We are in a much better situation than Scotland, which abolished tuition fees, where children from those backgrounds are twice as likely to go to university in this country. So, and yes, the debt amount, £50,000, sounds like a lot. We have to put that against the benefit. The benefit of a graduate degree is over your lifetime earnings of being a graduate is close to £1 million. So that's what this should be set against, is that if you go to university, you benefit from a degree, over your lifetime you will earn considerably more than someone who does not. So it is right that if you have the ability to, you should pay some of that back. And that's a system that we have. It's progressive, it's fair, it ensures our universities are well funded.
Well,
At this point on Germany,
let Ash answer on the progressive, because it is progressive in the way that you have just outlined, and people do have an awfully long time to pay it back. How else are we going to fund our institutions?
I think, one, we have to look at making sure that's the very richest in our society and corporations that pay their fair share. And just to come back on this issue of stats, dropout rates have increased since the introduction of 9K
Do you know what
fees.
they are? What are the dropout rates?
6% of first years will fail to move on to their second year of higher education.
As a result of tuition fees?
That's since 9K fees. And there's been a 0.5% increase year on year in that number. And when you look at the attainment gap, which is especially pronounced for working class and BAME students, that actually widens in higher education. So with all due respect, your stats are fraff.
Right. Well, let's put another question to Rishi, which is about maintenance grants. Was it a mistake for the coalition government to abolish maintenance grants? Because that has been a big deterrent to a lot of students from poorer backgrounds to try and reach university in the first place.
Well, the issue with grants is when we have a sum of money that we can allocate, we have to figure out how to benefit the greatest number of people.
Right.
And having grants means that there's ultimately a cap on how many people we can benefit. So transitioning it to a loan system means that many more people can go to university. And this point on Germany, Ash mentioned Germany. I mean, Germany can afford to have a different system, the reason being that only 20% of German students go to university. In this country, it's closer to half. So if we're going to have a system that many more people go to university, we need to have a fair system to pay for it. And having loans rather than grants means we can offer that opportunity to everybody who wants it.
Ash Thakur, thank you very much for coming in. Now, the summer recess is not far away, thank goodness. But there's still a busy week ahead in Westminster. Here's what's coming up. Later this afternoon, Theresa May will update MPs on the G20 summit that took place in Hamburg Tuesday. And as part of Theresa May's speech on building a fairer Britain, the government is expected to publish the Matthew Taylor review of employment practices in the modern economy. On Wednesday, it's the return of the weekly showdown between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn in Prime Minister's Questions. It's also election time for the chairs of 11 Commons select committees. Thursday marks Theresa May's first year as Prime Minister and will see the introduction of the government's repeal bill. That seeks to copy and paste all existing EU law onto the UK statute books. Right, let's very quickly pick up with one of those stories. Rishi, the select committees. 11 chairs are up for grabs, including the influential Treasury Committee, which until recently was headed up by the Conservative MP Andrew Tyree. Who would you like to see as chair?
You know, I haven't actually made up my mind yet, so I feel like an undecided voter that
Who's
I
it
normally
between?
knock on the doors of. You know, I've got all the leaflets. I think there's some incredibly high-quality candidates from across the board, actually, both sides, Brexit and Remain, if that's important.
Is it important to you?
Yeah, well, I'm actually thinking through that. I'm not sure it needs to be actually the most important factor in it. I think you want someone who's going to hold the government to account. That is the role of these things. And I think, as Chukka mentioned, they're a good example of us working cross-party. I think we want to put Parliament's interests first.
Chukka, are you going to have Brexit at the forefront of your mind when it comes to the chairs of these select committees? Nicky Morgan, Tory MP, used to be one of your Open Britain colleagues, obviously thinking along the same lines as you on Brexit.
It's certainly an important issue for me, and I think I've said publicly I want to see Nicky on the Treasury Select Committee for many other reasons, frankly, beyond Brexit. I used to serve on the Treasury Select Committee myself. I'd quite like to see a woman as well chair it, but I think she's the best person for the job. It's not her gender that's driving my vote. But there's some other amazing candidates. Tom Tugendhat is standing on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I think he could be, do some incredible things. Norman Lamb standing for Science and Technology.
All right, but what about the... Well, there are lots of you. Yeah. What about the 2015 intake of which you were part? Do you think there'll be some people from your intake?
Well, there are two. I mean, Tom Tugendhat, who Chukka mentioned, and also Johnny Mercer standing for chairman of the Defence Select Committee as well. I think that's, interesting. We as an intake are a relatively decent-sized part of the party. There's a feeling amongst some that it'd be nice to have some younger generation people coming through. Both Johnny and Tom, incredibly well qualified in their respective fields, and I think would do the job, very well.
Right. Well, of course, we'll know fairly shortly, I suppose, won't we? Thank you very much for today, and particularly thank you to you two, Rishi and Chukka, for being our guests of the day. If you have